Hello, this is Peter Sy for DellTechCenter.com. Today's demo covers Dell Lifecycle Controller configuration and firmware restore during a PowerEdge motherboard replacement. This is a new USC feature in the Dell Lifecycle Controller version 1.5. To start the demo, we're going to walk you through the steps required to back up the data that you need to restore later after you replace the motherboard. Over in this command window, we're going to look at a batch file called backup image time. It uses a WSMAN method, backup image, which takes advantage of the LC service class. We're going to pass in a parameter, which is the IP address of the idrac inside the system we want to back up. We're backing up our data to a CIF share in this instance, so we pass in the IP address of that share. If you change the share type parameter, you can actually back up to the vFlash on the idrac. You can send the data to the SD card present there. Now we run the batch file, passing in the IP address of the idrac inside the system we want to back up. And now that kicks off the process. In a second here, we're going to see a unique identifier returned to us. This is a job ID that we pass to the next batch file that pings the idrac for backup status. Now let's take a look at that batch file. You can see here that it takes in that unique identifier we mentioned earlier, as well as an IP address, which will point to the idrac. Now we run get.bat. It'll continually loop getJobStatus.bat, and we pass in those same parameters, the job ID and the IP address of the track. What the batch file returns is current status on the backup, including the current stage that we're at and the percentage complete. Right now we're collecting Lifecycle Controller firmware images, and we're at 50%. On the right side of the screen, we can see the CIF share in a Windows Explorer window where we're saving our backup image to. Over time, you see that the image slowly grows in size. Going back to the command window, we see time passing us by because we sped up this video, so you don't have to sit through the 30-minute backup process. The backup time will depend on your system configuration, but usually it's around 30 minutes. During this time, we back up Lifecycle Controller firmware, USC info, configuration settings, hardware, configuration info, and firmware images. You can see that our backup file has now reached 80 megabytes, and we're actually finished with our backup process. As you can see, it's 100% complete. Now we're going to use racadmin to ping the idrac to get the log. You can also view these logs through the idrac GUI or through the USC Lifecycle Controller logs. In the logs, you can see that the backup process collected hardware and firmware inventory information, as well as information from the Lifecycle Controller and the idrac. We sped up the video of the motherboard replacement. Hands don't actually move that fast. Now we're going to remove all the peripheral cards. When removing the cards, remember where they came from, because when you put the motherboard back in, you want to put the PCI cards back in the same slots that they came from. So we're just going to wait a little bit longer for all the components to be put back in place. I just took my ESD training, so I should remind you to always stay grounded and wear a wrist strap so that no electrostatic damage happens to your system. After replacing the motherboard, the default IP address of the idrac should be 192.168.0.120. In this case, we hit Ctrl-E during post to set it to 192.168.0.79. When we ping the old IP address of the idrac, we see it's no longer there. Instead, it's at the IP address ending in 79. In the BIOS, we note that the version is 2.3.2. There's no service tag or asset tag. Later, after we perform the restore, we should see the BIOS updated to the latest version that was present before we did the backup, and also the service tag and asset tag should be the same as before the backup. By default, the restore operation will preserve your original virtual disk config. If you want, during the restore, you can set the VD config parameter to 0 to delete your original VD config. If you use this option, you restore the RAID level and attributes of your VD, but your data will not be restored. To see all the supported backup and restore parameters, you can check the WSMAN MOFs on DellTechCenter.com. So now we've booted back into the operating system, and we're going to perform a restore. We're going to restore that same image we backed up earlier, and the batch file is almost exactly the same, using the same LC service class. We're just performing restore image instead of backup image. Looking closer at the batch file, you can see we're still referencing that same CIF share and the same backup image that we created earlier. We also get a unique job ID again that we pass to the batch file that we use to monitor progress. The operating system on our target system will shut down gracefully, and when it reboots, it'll boot into USC, where we're going to perform the firmware and configuration updates. From the command window that we're running, we can see the percentage complete and what task is currently running. The whole restore process shouldn't take more than an hour, and after USC finishes all of its configuration updates, the system will reboot and restore idrac firmware and configuration info, including the original IP address we had when we backed up the system. So now we're pinging here and we see that we do get a reply from the original IP address. So now our idrac has reverted back to the original IP address we had when we backed up the system, so we've lost virtual console connection. We go back into the web interface and then we restart the virtual console view. When we do get back into that view, we can check the BIOS. And if you remember, our BIOS version from the new motherboard was 2.3.2. And now we're back at 2.3.3. We have a service tag and an asset tag. Now that our restore operation is complete, let's use rack admin one more time to see the rack log to see everything that happened during the restore process. Starting at the top of the log, you can see the original entries when the backup was originally taken, and then slightly below that you can see when the restore operation began. Here you can see that the Broadcom firmware is being updated, also the PERC firmware being updated here. Later you see the configuration information being restored for both of those devices, and when you scroll down even further you can see that the firmware and the configuration for the idrac is being updated as well. The entire process took less than 2 hours, and hopefully this backup restore process can save you a lot of time in the data center. That concludes our demonstration of the Dell Lifecycle Controller configuration and firmware restore during a PowerEdge motherboard replacement. For more information on Dell Enterprise technology, go to delltechcenter.com.